Merhabalar, tekrar hoş geldiniz. Duyuruları ekranda gördüğünüz gibi etkinliğimizde çeviri olacak. Türkçe dinlemek için etkinliği lütfen aşağıdaki dünya butonuyla ifade edilen Interpretation butonundan Türkçe kanalını seçin. Orijinal dilde dinlemek istiyorsanız herhangi bir kanalı seçmeniz gerekmiyor. Sugender adına size hoş geldiniz demek isterim öncelikle. 2020'den bu yana düzenlemekte olduğumuz Cinsel Taciz, Cinsiyete Dayalı Şiddet ve Ayrımcılık, Araştırma, Eylem, Yazma, Deneyimleri webinarımızın 12.sindeyiz ve çok mutluyuz. Bu webinarlar kapsamında üniversite içinde ve dışında cinsel taciz, cinsiyete dayalı şiddet, çeşitlilik ve kapsayıcılık konularına yönelik bir tartışma alanı yaratmayı umuştuk ve böyle başladık bu yola. Bu seriye başlarkenki bir amacımız farklı üniversite, araştırma merkezi, sivil toplum kurumlarından uzmanları, araştırmacıları, aktivistleri dinlemek, onların deneyimlerinden öğrenmek ve bu konuda çalışan insanlar arasında bir köprü oluşturmak, bir topluluk oluşturmaktı. Umuyoruz ki bunu da şimdiye kadar yapmakta başarılı olduk. Çok fazla farklı ülkeden bu alanda yapılmış araştırmalar dinledik. Sadece araştırmalarla da kalmadık. Aynı zamanda üniversite ve üniversite dışında, sivil toplumda, medyada örneğin kurulan çeşitli mekanizmalara dair fikir edinme, birbirimizle deneyimler üzerine konuşma fırsatı bulduk. Ve bugün 12. webinarımızdayız. Tekrar hoş geldiniz. Bugünkü konuşmacımız Angela Santamaria. Kendisi Kolombiya'daki Rosario Üniversitesi'nde öğretim üyesi, profesör. Konuşmasının başlığı Kolombiya'nın Karayip bölgesinde yerel kadın deneyimleri. Cinsel şiddetten hayatta kalmak için geliştirilen pratikler. Çok kısaca ben size kendisini tanıtmak istiyorum. Şimdi İngilizceye döneceğim o yüzden. I'll switch to English now to introduce our speaker to you. Angela Santamaria is a professor, a lawyer, has a PhD in sociology from EHESS, Paris. For the last 15 years, Angela has worked at the Intercultural Studies Center at Rosario University, which is dedicated to propose educational activities in indigenous communities in Colombia. Angela's personal and academic project deals with the democratization process of higher education in her country. Last year, Angela has co-founded the Peace and Conflict Center at Rosario University, YANUS. This center aims at increasing the capacity of indigenous and Afro-Colombian people, peasants, and indigenous and rural women to consolidate peace processes in their communities. Angela has also worked with NYU on an international project about leadership, social identity, and global transformation in a comparative perspective, and with Lyon 2 University on how to do politics in a peacetime, again, a comparative project. So Angela, thanks for coming. The floor is yours. So we'll be listening to what sounds like a very inspiring topic and experiences. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Professor Begun and Ceylan and everybody to be here. I am so happy to share with us some of the results and methodological perspective of my work. Do you see the PowerPoint slides?
Okay. Yes, we can see it. It's
okay.
It's not in the presenter mode though. If you prefer the presenter, yeah, okay, it is now.
Okay, perfect. Well, I am Angela. I am a professor in this intercultural center, and I want to talk about a specific project. It's not really a project. It's the program of micro memories of indigenous women in 2 regions in Colombia, the Caribbean coast and the Amazon forest in the border with Brazil, Peru, and in the case of the Caribbean coast, we are in the border with Venezuela. My country is a very complex society, and we have been in the middle of an armed conflict during more than 50 years. 4 years ago, the president Juan Manuel Santos signed a peace accord with the oldest guerrilla of the country, the FARC. And it was a very interesting period for us as academics and researchers to work with indigenous women, survivors of sexual violence related to conflict, armed conflict, and at the same time to work with ex-combatants, indigenous women, ex-combatants from FARC. These conflict armed have been have a lot of actors. The army, the Colombian army, neo-paramilitary groups, guerrillas, and in the context of our country, the huge problematic of narco-traffic and narco-traffic cartels, Mexican cartels and Colombian cartels. In this sense, I want to share some of the issues of my center, of our center. We have an intercultural academic mention with 5 new members. Is a intercultural, intergenerational, interdisciplinary, and intersectional team. I have the privilege to work with the first indigenous woman from Arhuaco people who is a professor in our institution. And I have the privilege to work with the first Afro-Colombian professor, Diana Angulo, in our institution. This research project is a local project. We work at the local level with communities, but it's impossible to work with these communities if we can offer a lobbying practices with national level and international level to make practices of and to promote advocacy practices of human rights and sexual rights and reproductive rights cases and of violence. Specifically in my country, we don't have only one type of violence. It's like a continuum of different violence, a very complex continuum. For example, in the case of indigenous women, we have the colonial violence against them, structural violence, political violence, sexual violence, domestic violence and sexual violence related to armed conflict, internal armed conflict, environmental violence, reproductive violence. It's really very hard to work with these communities because the painful memories, the harm, the notion of harm, of reparation, of restoration is not a liberal conception, a legal conception from liberalism, but it's a very complex harm. Because when we talk about sexual violence in these communities, there exists a collective dimension of sexual violence. And the violence against indigenous women is not only the violence against individuals, but the sexual violence against the sexual order of Mother Earth. And for this community, the rivers, the stones, the mountains, the oceans, the universe are alive. And the Colombian constitution and the Colombian legal system recognize these earth beings as subjects of law. The nature and this relation between women and nature have a legal subjectivity. I think it's a lot of information, and I think our legal system is I think is the first, perhaps in India or in New Zealand. Some courts have been protected the rivers and the sacred mountains, but we have some iconic cases in the world. Yes, it's really this perspective of eco-diversity, ecofeminism, and the reparation of this harm is a big challenge, a huge challenge for the global legal comprehension. No, it's a problem of how we can open the epistemological discussion and how we can think about methodological tools to understand the relation between the human and the non-human, and to think about how we can do advocacy and reparation in these areas. In this sense, we have more than 6,500 indigenous people, and specifically 3,000 indigenous women, girls, and elders in different regions in Colombia. I think specifically our work is very strong in the Amazon region and in the Caribbean coast. And we have a very interesting partnership with NYU at New York University and the Center of Latin American Studies and the Wagner Center. And in this partnership, it was very interesting because more than 2,000 indigenous women belonging to local schools of diplomacy, of political participation, rights schools, have been prepared to participate in the UN system in the United States. Now I want to talk about our perspective, methodological perspective. In Colombia, it's very difficult to work, and I think this is why I think the work of SU Gender Center is so interesting for us. It's impossible to do research if you don't propose action, research, and activism to indigenous movement, Black American movement, and yes, in general, the movement, the women collective, action, LGBTI collective, etc. And we have this man, Orlando Falsborda. He's a sociologist from Colombia, and he talks about participatory action research. Participatory action research is a very interesting perspective because we can propose to a co-participation, co-designing processes for the diagnostic phase, the implementation of the project, co-writing processes, co-publication, the collective or the community, in this case, our ally, our partners at the local level are not an object of the. We don't use this concept like objects or field work. We don't have the right to do field work, because this field work is the life of our partners. They are sisters for us, they are partners, but not objects or subjects in the process of production. We are in a horizontal relation to produce a dialogue of knowledge. Yes, it's difficult in the practice, but we have these sort of rules. And in this sense, we propose an ethnic and gender perspective of participatory action research, because Falsborda introduced this wonderful perspective, but he didn't think about gender issues, ethnic issues, spiritual issues. And I think it's a good start, but we need to do a transformation of this perspective. The critical pedagogy of Paulo Freire is a Brazilian educator, is really important for us, because when we talk about research, we are talking in Colombia about learning and research and activism. And in this sense, for us, it's important to use the classic methods of social sciences, as interviews, ethnography, etc. But we are in this moment, thinking about other kind of communication, and in this sense we elaborate with our partners at the local level a toolbox for social and cultural transformation, where for example our partners by for example, I have my fieldwork, but for example, Digneris Izquierdo is my partner at the local level. She has her journal, her fieldwork journal. And we, for example, we have an experience of a journal, fieldwork journal circle, and we exchange our journal, but it's not easy, but we try every day and every time to yes, the deconstruction of this relation between the subject, object, and the researcher. For us and for indigenous women, is very important the question of rituality, religion, more rituality than religion, because they have another cosmology of the world, other language, sexuality. So the order, the sexual order is different. And in this sense, the conception of body is different. For us, for example, the body is an individual body. In these communities, the body is a collective thing. And in this sense, the body painting and social cartography is a very interesting tool. For example, to talk about sexual violence, but at the same time, they want to talk about resistance and agency, not only painful memories, not only about harm, not only about advocacy, but at the same time, the possibility to have a new perspective of their body, the future, the present, and the past. The temporalities are different in these communities, and in this sense, we have developed protocols, spiritual and ethnic protocols for work with them, and it was a very interesting experience. Here we have some examples in the picture. For example, we use the elaboration of dolls to talk about identity, theater. Here we have some of the picture of using theater to talk about a big extractivist mega project in this region related to sexual violence and domestic violence, dances, music, etc. I want to talk a little about the comparative perspective, because for us it's very important the experience from Peru, for example, and Mexico and Guatemala in the region, because the Inter-American system of human rights have only three iconic cases about sexual violence related to conflict against indigenous women. The first case is the case of the Gonzalez sisters. This case is Gonzalez sisters against Mexican army. Valentina Cantú Rosendo against Mexican army, and Tia Tujan and Maria Josefa Tujan against the army of Guatemala. And in this sense, the Inter-American Court promote and make a very interesting legal decisions where the sexual violence related to conflict against indigenous women have been considered for the first time in our region as a humanity crime. And they propose and they decide that it's possible to think about a collective perspective and of reparation in the case of indigenous women, in relation with their cosmologies and worldview. And for us, it's very important to have these iconic decisions. This is a picture of one of the project participatory action research led by Ana Iris. Ana Iris is one of the most incredible leaders in the region. And for example, this is a representation, a social cartography of the spiritual and sacred sites in this region. In this region, the sacred sites are like tribunals, like a court, in this conception of spiritual litigation with Mother Earth. These mountains are, for example, for Mestizo people, only mountains, but for the feminine indigenous authority, female indigenous authority, the litigation and the self-reparation processes is most important for these women, these sacred sites as spiritual courts or spiritual litigation places that, for example, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Washington. At the United States. And this is difficult to understand for the lawyers in my country and for the ordinary justice. We have three kinds of justice in this moment. Ordinary justice is the national justice for everybody. The peace, special peace justice After the peace accords with FARC, we have a special justice for ex-combatants from FARC and the victims of FARC. And we have an indigenous justice. But the common thing is for indigenous women and for survivors of sexual violence related to armed conflict, it's impossible to access of this pluralism, legal pluralism. And because they need to pay a lawyer, the ordinary justice and the peace justice is a Spanish, the language of the justice is Spanish, and these people don't speak Spanish. To have access at a tribunal, you need to walk 9 hours. After you need to pay an airplane ticket, after you need to pay a lawyer, etc. And in this sense, we are working now in this project. Our principal goal is to analyze and to reconstruct these cases, these iconic cases of sexual violence, but not in our perspective or the perspective of the urban lawyer at Bogota, the capital of Colombia, but we are interested in the interpretation of their own conception of sexual violence. For example, the notion of sexual violence don't exist in indigenous languages. When we want to translate the term, the concept, we can't. And the concept of harm don't exist. The concept of reparation don't exist. It's a very difficult work, and we need to begin to understand what is pain, what is harm for these communities, how we can restore this pain as a society, as a intercultural society. And after, perhaps we can work together. In this sense, we are this is the first phase. We want to strengthen the forms of spiritual litigation and advocacy in this relation of the human and non-human practices of law, and after to try to translate this difficult question in the language of tribunals, courts, peace, truth commission, etc. And for this big goal, huge goal, the experience of, for example, Guatemala is very important for us, Peru, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we hope this region should be very important for us to exchange experiences and tensions, etc. Finally, I want to talk a little about the specific of the methodological perspective when we work with indigenous women related to conflict, to armed conflict, because we need to promote an ethnic and gender equity approach. And for example, it's very important to think about how we can reconstruct this story, because it's so painful for the survivors, for their families, for us, for everybody. And as I said, we have a lot of structural obstacles to access justice and legal education in my country. Only the stigmatization and rejection in the communities is a big challenge for us. And we need to promote to a reflection about the damage to sexuality in this kind of crimes. Because, for example, it's difficult to talk about pleasure, about frigidity, marital conflicts, and, for example, the children who born after these practices of sexual violence related to conflict. They are as a life legacy of the crime, but they are sometimes they are in the community, sometimes they are outside the community, and it's very important to think how we can work with them. I think I have 2 minutes or 5 minutes. I don't know. I don't.
Yes, please go on.
Yes. Okay. For us, the theoretical framework is too very important. We try to put in the center of our comprehension the perspective of female spiritual authorities of indigenous peoples and black Colombian communities. And for us, the voice, the perspective, for example, of a saga, I know it's difficult to settle that, but I don't know how I can explain. It's like a feminine iman in my country. This is the only people indigenous people in the region who has spiritual female authorities. And for us, this perspective is so important that, for example, the work of Kimberly Taden, she's an anthropologist. I think the better in the in the field of sexual violence that related to armed conflicts. But for us, both of them are important, and the interesting thing is how we can dialogue between these different kind of knowledge. For example, Pacha Bueno Hanses, and another, I think she's a political American professor, Rita Laura Segato, who works about femicide and systematic violence against indigenous and Black American women, Elizabeth Wood, and some intellectual as Fanny Quiro. She's from Witoto peoples from Amazon region. And finally, I want to share some of the results. This is a workshop with indigenous ex-combatants from FARC during the reintegration process after the peace agreement signature. And as we can see, it was very touching for me to work with these women, because even if we can see, for example, in this body mapping experience, how they deal with the civic and communitarian belonging, and at the same time with their warrior and Farian identity. Yes, for example, in the case of Solange, is a broken body. No? The one side is a warrior and the other side is a member of a community. Is a very hard experience to work with these women, but I think is necessary. Here we have, for example, some of the when they have been confined in a region during more than 4 years, I think. and they didn't have access to clothes, to food. And for example, this is a cartography on how they design their clothes, how they produce sugar, their experience during the bombardments of government, etc. And at the same time, here we have some body painting with survivors of sexual violence related to armed conflict in Amazon region. For example, in the case of this body, it was the first time that this woman talked about her experience, and she used, for example, poetry. She used these drawing practices, songs, dance. It was very interesting because interviews, it's not possible to do interviews about these issues because it's a sort of re-victimization process to ask again who, when, why, how. And I think the art-based research should be a really interesting perspective for us. And finally, this is a new experience. Noah is the artist who, with an indigenous woman, who make these ethnic and gender sensitive comics about the case of Congolese experience of Kavumu case. This is a horrible case, but an iconic case for us, where 26 girls, baby girls, survivors of sexual violence related to conflict by the militias of Kavumu, have been abused. And Denis Mukwege, the Nobel Prize, founded the Pansy Hospitals to fight against this kind of crimes. But for our partners, it's impossible to access of this information because they don't speak, they don't read Spanish, English, and in this case, an indigenous woman translate the comic elaborated by this transgender student in Arhuaco language. And now we have this idea, and perhaps it could be an interesting exchange to think about, for example, what case in Turkey should be an iconic cases for the people in Colombia, in Peru, in Guatemala, etc. I think it's okay because I speak a lot, and I want to share more with you. Thank you.
Angela, thank you so much. It was very interesting on a very, very difficult subject matter, and I have a lot of questions, and it made us, I think, all of us think about both the content and also the way in which you do this research. A lot of questions about methodology are raised here, and it would be very interesting to think about possible collaborations and comparisons with Turkey. And this last question that you left us with about thinking about iconic cases in Turkey would be very interesting. I'm sure people, our audience, will also have input. Well, I would also like to thank our interpreters, Ceylan Gürman and Sungur Savran, for being with us throughout the webinar series and for this particular webinar as well. And now we can open the floor to questions. You can write your questions in chats, and I'll be happy to read them out loud and pose them to Angela. So our audience or anyone in the Zoom room can, or we also receive questions from YouTube. Oh no, not YouTube, sorry. It's not live. You can write your questions in the chat box. While people are formulating their questions, I can start with a question of my own. So maybe two, because they're related, Angela, if you don't mind. So I was wondering whether you can talk a little bit more about how is it different to do participatory action research with survivors of sexual violence from doing participatory action research with any other community? And what does the researcher have to know or do or practice? What kind of principles, what kind of knowledge, epistemic resources do you need to do this kind of participatory action research with survivors? Another question is about interpretation and the co-analysis in participatory action research in this particular subject matter. You told us something very interesting. You pose this difference between different spheres of law in Colombia, like these three forms of legality. And you said that in the indigenous community, in the language, there are no concepts for some of these, like for harm, for sexual violence, right? So there is some kind of a, I don't know if it would be the right frame to use it, but epistemic injustice, because they don't have the necessary language, but they do have it probably, but not in their own language, right? So in this kind of research, you have to do some kind of an interpretation and an analysis to translate these two different forms to each other, but then you do it together with the survivors because it's participatory action research. So can you talk a little bit more about how that co-analysis works and how you try to do it without reenacting or over-interpreting or reenacting any sort of injustice? And I was wondering whether these formal legal spheres learn from the indigenous language and how they represent, present, or talk about sexual violence and the experiences. It was hard for me to formulate the question, so it was a bit long, sorry.
No, it's really interesting. I don't have, I think, an answer. Zeynep, but I can talk a little about our experience. I think it's a dream. Yes, the participatory action research with survivors. But during the last 4 years, we began this project, and the first thing that I want to share is the protocol, the spiritual and cultural protocols to work with this community. And for me, it was very interesting because I don't know how we can translate, but the female spiritual authority, the most important woman in this community, she said, if you want to work with me, we need to give me biological materials and resources. Because when we are talking with Mother Earth, your titles, your publication, your methodologies, she didn't understand this language, Mother Earth, and this authority, she said, and neither me. And for example, she asked me for a very specific material, and it was the menstrual, the monarchy, the first blood of an indigenous women of other region. This was her first request. And the second was if we are talking about death, we are talking about sexual violence, we need to found, because it's very difficult to explain. They work like using an harmonization practices between the energy of death and the energy of life. And to do that, like a lawyer, like a very important lawyer in the world, they need documents, but not documents in paper, but spiritual and energetical documents. I think this was the most difficult, Zeynep, because we worked during two years to co-design this spiritual protocol. And for example, when I said I will be in Turkey, she said, "Oh, I need the water of the Bosphorus, this site that you said is very important, because when we are talking about sexuality, order, we are talking about water, and the water is feminine. It's a very big, very difficult worldview, but I think first of all, we need to take seriously their expectation of reparation, because, for example, for the legal system, the national or international system, when we're talking of reparation, we're talking of money, we're talking of monuments, we're talking of public apologies. When we talk about reparation for these people now, we are talking of the reparation between the human and the non-human, and you can work if you don't have material resources, natural resources, biology, etc., etc. This was the most difficult. And secondly, it's difficult because I think, as you said, we are every day promoting epistemic injustices, of course. And but I think the possibility to work together, yes, and not to impose my perspective of the perspective of my team, to have intercultural teams should be not an answer but a possibility. And in this sense, I think the papers are very important for the academic world, but we need to think about new products. Yes, for example, rituals for in this work is crucial. Music and songs, because for them the language, the legal language for self-reparation is the music, the sacred music. Yes, I think it's very difficult to answer, Zeynep. I can answer, but I think you put in the center a very interesting question.
Thank you so much, Angela. Yes, there's a question in chat. I'll read it. You can read it yourself, but I'll also read it out loud for the interpreters so that it can be translated to Turkish. So, Angela, how do you think using methods related to arts and nature helps to describe some common experiences related to sexual violence? Is there a possibility of creating another language for alternative ways of activism, especially for eco-feminist struggles around the world?
Yes, I think this is the central question, because, for example, as academic team, We participate during the last 3 years in rituals during 1 week, for example, every month, and it was it's crucial, yes, because when we are talking of ecofeminism in these communities, the non-human is very important, and we need to think how I can do multi-species ethnography, how I can interview a river, how I can understand the language of the mountain. Yes, no, it's not possible for us at the moment. In this sense, I think we need to establish partnership with the people who can do that and take this perspective of knowledge seriously. Yes, because, for example, my spiritual female partner, she speaks with rivers. Yes, for example, when I will come back with a little bottle of water of the Bosphorus, she talked with this water. Yes, and she can have access to the history of this region in this conversation. But it's difficult to understand for us as Occidental people. This could be possible. I think we need to have an opening epistemological reflection. If we can do that, I think we can have a very different experience to researching processes and learning processes. No, but I think it's a very interesting question. I don't have the answer.
No, you do. You are already answering. Very interesting. But I think we all need to think more about it, right? It's also very new for us. Do we have any other questions? Başka soru var mı? Is there anything that you would like to add, Angela?
No, thank you. Thank you very much. It was an incredible experience for me.
Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing this wonderful research with us. It's very interesting, and definitely, if you can share with us any materials that we can read, it would be great.
Of course. Of course.
I would like to read more about your research, and then maybe we can talk about any possibilities for cooperation, doing further research together, to learn from the multiple methodologies that you're using. I'm sure a lot of researchers would benefit from it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you once again for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us and being with us for the 12th of the series of our webinar series. And thank you, Hülya Adak, Sugender Director, who is one of the organizers of this series. Unfortunately, Hülya had another meeting scheduled at the last minute, so she couldn't be with us today. So Begüm Acar and myself, we are organizing the series together with Hülya Adak. And thank you, Berfin, for assisting the webinar. And I thank once again Ceylan Gürman and Sungur Savran for interpreting the talk and the event. So thank you, Angela. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Çok teşekkürler herkese geldiğiniz için. İyi akşamlar.